It seems like Iran's approach throughout this war has really been one of strategic patience, essentially betting that it can simply outlast the United States. And when it comes to retaliation, Iran appears to be mirroring whatever Washington does. If the U.S. strikes, Iran responds in kind, largely to prove it can match any escalation the U.S. throws at it, which sends a clear message that Washington can't just escalate its way into forcing Iranian capitulation. Honestly, that strategy seems to have worked pretty well so far. I'd even say Iran is winning this war at this point, but something does seem to be shifting. I'm not sure if it's the new IRGC leadership driving this, or just Iran entering a new phase altogether, but it does look like Iran is becoming more offensive, not just rhetorically, but in actual practice. Can you walk us through what's actually happening inside Iran right now?
Sure. I don't believe that the change in the uh, leadership in the armed forces, or at least for the most part, the IRGC. It's not just the IRGC; it's also the regular army, but it's mostly the IRGC. I don't think that is any there's any major change in that because first of all, these commanders were in charge already. Their names had not been declared for security reasons. I think that the fact that their names have now been declared shows a greater confidence in Iran about security. We also had almost simultaneous with this news, uh, other news that President Pezeshkian met Ayatollah Seyed Moshtaba Khamenei for a 7 to 8 hour meeting, which again shows that things are moving back to normal and that the news about meetings are the highest level meetings are being uh, put out there for the public, that the names of those who are leading the armed forces, the, who replaced the martyrs, they're being declared. That I think is significant in itself. What has changed is the chair of the Supreme National Security Council uh, being well, a new person being put in charge of the chairmanship of the Supreme National Security Council, Major General Mohsen Rezaei. Now, this is significant, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, I think that General Rezaei is more powerful and influential than the previous chair, who was made chair of the Supreme National Security Council after Dr. Larijani was martyred by the Trump and Netanyahu coalition. Uh, so he is a much stronger person. He has a greater background in um, management and in managing key organizations. So he basically was in charge. He was in charge of the guards, the Revolutionary Guards, when the war started between when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in 1980, at the with the support of the West and the Soviet Union at that time. So he led the guards throughout those years, and when he was in charge, the guards was a small organization with with light weapons at best. So he, during those years, he created effectively the IRGC into becoming what it is today. And he led it, I think, for 16 years, if I'm not mistaken. Then he also has a PhD in economics. He was a deputy to uh, uh, President Raisi, his economic deputy. So he knows about economic issues. He knows about political issues. He's been a high-ranking official. He's obviously a person who has a great deal of capabilities and knowledge that will be important for his position, because the Supreme National Security Council is not just about military. It's not about just about war. It's about foreign policy. It's about economics. It's about all things that are important for the security of the nation. And members of the council include key economic figures in the government, the foreign ministry, and key members of parliament for different meetings, depending on what the topic is. So he's a stronger person, he's more influential, and he has a lot more experience. That's one aspect of it. So I think that this is going to make the Supreme National Security Council a more powerful entity in the state than before, simply because of his character. Because since he is so well known in political circles and he's a public figure, he can more easily coordinate the key actors in the state: the president, the speaker of parliament, the head of the judiciary, the armed forces, the state-owned foundations, and so on. In addition to that, we know that his position, his public position, is towards the United States and towards the Israeli regime and towards this coalition that has been created against Iran, is more assertive, significantly more assertive. And so I think that his view on the conflict or on the war that's been waged against Iran is to be on the offensive, more on the offensive. In the past, as you rightly pointed out, the Iranians would retaliate as time went on. Iran's retaliation usually was more severe than the American strikes. So especially during the last episode, the last chapter of violence after the United States tore up the MOU and restarted the war, the Iranian responses became increasingly harsh towards the Americans. In other words, if the Americans hit a target, the Iranians would do more. They would hit back harder. But I think that Dr. Rezaei's view on the situation goes further than this, and that he is going to be much more decisive. If the United States escalates, whether through economic pressure or military pressure, I think that his response is going to be much more decisive and much more painful to the anti-Iranian coalition. So I think this is a substantial change. And also, since he is a major general, all of the commanders in all of the different parts of the armed forces, they are going to have he's going to be able to easily communicate with them and to understand their issues, and so he's going to be able to help the armed forces more than probably anyone else.
It seems like the United States has essentially painted itself into a corner here. It doesn't really have a convincing path to victory, if it ever did, so it can't win this. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to know how to end the war either. Sure, they've signed documents, the Memorandum of Understanding being the most significant one, but politically, actually following through on what they signed looks nearly impossible for the Americans. It's hard to imagine them formally accepting Iranian administration over Hormuz, returning Iran's frozen assets, or paying out those $300 billion in reparations. They might put their signature on paper, but actually delivering on it is another matter entirely, which leaves them stuck, unable to win and without a real path to peace either. Meanwhile, Trump seems to be digging himself deeper into increasingly outlandish rhetoric, claiming the Strait of Hormuz is wide open under U.S. control, that some steel wall has been built, that once Iran is fully defeated, Hormuz will become U.S. territory. The rhetoric just keeps getting more extreme as the situation worsens for Washington, which really shows how desperate they've become. And when great powers get desperate, they don't just do foolish things. They can turn genuinely aggressive. So I'm curious, how do you see the days, maybe weeks ahead? Are we heading toward another round of fighting?
There's a possibility of war. The Americans have informed Iran through third parties that they are preparing for a strike, preparing for war. The Iranians, now it doesn't mean that will necessarily happen, but that those messages have been sent. The Iranians have also seen the U.S. build up in the region. They are prepared for war, and the Iranians are preparing for war. They're fully prepared, and they're continuing to expand their missile program, their drone program. They're developing new missiles. They are expanding their underground missile and drone bases and their factories, as well as their command and control centers. They're uh, basically preparing also the country for a long-term war. The government has been shifting towards a wartime economy. And I think the Supreme National Security Council has played an important role in that as well. So Iran is prepared both for another wave of attacks that could last at least a week or two, and they are also preparing for a war that would last until the end of Trump's presidency. Now, it doesn't mean that the war will last until then, and it doesn't mean that the United States will strike, but the Iranians are preparing themselves. Also, the Iranians have warned that right now the Strait of Hormuz is closed, of course, but Iran does allow some ships to go through, both through its own corridor, which is easily accessible through the internet, but also from the Omani coastline. Some ships do go through, and those are largely with Iranian coordination. In other words, through the Iranian corridor, ships that are from countries friendly to Iran, they can pass through, those that haven't participated in war. But sometimes there may be a ship or some ships that are from countries that are friendly to Iran, but they are afraid to go from the Iranian corridor out of fear of punishment. So on some occasions, the Iranians allow them to go alongside the Omani coast. Or there are some deals going on. I mean, there are negotiations taking place, and there have always been negotiations taking place between Iran and the countries in the Persian Gulf. So sometimes Iran allows some ships to go through based on agreements that exist between, let's say, the United Arab Emirates and Iran. So these things do exist. But if the United States escalates economic warfare, the Iranians, we've heard that the Iranians could start targeting U.S. naval ships. Iran is known to have capabilities that it has not used because it does not want to go up the escalation ladder too far, for the time being at least. But also Iran will completely shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That will be one of its responses. And that means just complete shutdown where nothing gets through, and probably no pipelines would be functioning either, whether in the Emirates or in Saudi Arabia. So there are, the Iranians are prepared for all sorts of escalation, whether it's economic escalation, whether it's military escalation, but ultimately they're prepared for a very long fight.
Right, and like I mentioned, I think the core of the problem is that the only real off-ramp for the U.S. would be a return to the old status quo. But for obvious reasons, that's completely unacceptable to Iran. They can't just go back to another 47 years of the same arrangement. Given that, it seems like we're heading toward another round of escalation, with Iran now positioned to act more confidently and take a more offensive posture. But what would that actually look like in practice? Do you think the Iranians might target U.S. aircraft carriers directly? Or take a harder line against America's regional allies in the Gulf? At the same time, we're also seeing reports that countries like the UAE are apparently transferring money to Iran, essentially trying to buy their way out of this conflict. So I'm curious what's really going on here, because something is clearly brewing beneath the surface.
Well, I don't know the exact details, but something is happening between Iran and the Emirates. I don't know if Iran would call it reparations or what it would call it, but the Emirates, of course, has played a very devastating role, like all the others. They assisted the United States in targeting Iran, in killing Iranian civilians and citizens and leaders, uh, but but also Iranian infrastructure, of course. But the Emir and by the way, these countries in the Persian Gulf that have assisted the United States in this war, it's not just that they've been given their airspace or their territory or access to their space and their territory to use against Iran. They also fund the war because the U.S. bases in these countries have the expenses are paid for by the host countries. So, and during the war, when the expenses were going up, uh, they gave more assistance. In fact, the Iranians have evidence that at some point during the 40-day hot war, the Emiratis, the Qataris were having problems paying. They didn't have the cash necessary for technical reasons or whatever reasons to fund this. So their role in this war has been quite outrageous in the eyes of Iranians. But in any case, there is something going on between the Emirates and Iran at the moment. I don't know the details, but that is linked to why there is a limited number of ships that are allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Um, the I think the Iranians are going to, as the Americans would like to say, for them all options are on the table, and that would mean both targeting U.S. naval assets, but also uh, the countries that have been hosting U.S. bases. And the United States has not left these countries; their bases have been either destroyed or partially destroyed, or mostly destroyed, not partially destroyed. But U.S. forces are now based in hotels, in buildings that are not linked to any military. So they currently exist, especially in Kuwait and in Bahrain. The governments are particularly helpful to the U.S. military, but in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and in Qatar and also in Oman, they have a significant presence. But I think that the Iranians are weighing all their options. It depends on the form of escalation. If the United States escalates in a particular way, they will respond in a particular way. That's what we've seen throughout this 5.5 months. But the difference today is that it seems clear that Ayatollah Khamenei wanted Major General Rezaei to be the chair of the Supreme National Security Council because he wants to uh, respond to U.S. and Israeli aggression against Iran, but also across the region in a more decisive and proactive way.
And if, in the course of retaliation, Iran doesn't just target the United States and Israel, but also goes after the Gulf monarchies, how vulnerable are they at this point? They've already taken a fairly significant hit over the past few months. But if we're talking about climbing further up the escalation ladder, what exactly might that look like this time around?
Well, Glenn, if we look at Iran's military capabilities and how they've evolved from True Promise 1, when uh, Ismail Haniyeh was martyred in Tehran right after President Pezeshkian's inaugural ceremony, Iran struck the Israeli regime, and it was called True Promise 1. If you compare True Promise 1 to True Promise 2 and then 3, and now and at the beginning of this war, the current war, and the latest chapter in this war a few weeks ago when the Americans restarted the fighting after tearing up the MOU effectively, we see that Iran's capabilities have improved dramatically. at all levels, whether it's air defense and downing U.S. Drones, and uh, whether it's Iran's capabilities, planes, capabilities in striking with greater precision and greater devastation. Iran's capabilities have changed. And the very fact that also they've announced the names of the new commanders who've been in charge already for the last few months, but it shows that the underground facilities that need to be created for warfare, the are have been put in place, have been built. It shows that Iran's missile capabilities are improving. In other words, R&D continues as the war goes on, and of course they have enormous experience now with their missiles. So in the next chapter, I think that Iran's strikes will be far more decisive, and Iran will be capable of doing whatever they want to these monarchies in the Persian Gulf very swift. So I've always said, and I've said this for years, that these monarchies put themselves at risk by assisting the United States in aggression. But and I've said during the past few months that these countries will collapse if Iran targets them in retaliation, if Trump actually carries out his threat to send Iran back to the Stone Age and so on. But literally every day that goes by, Iran's capabilities increase. And so I think it becomes easier and easier for Iran to hurt them decisively and to inflict pain on them that they simply cannot tolerate. But also, Iran's capabilities in striking Israel, the Israeli regime, are much greater today than even a few months ago. The precision of Iranian missiles is becoming far more devastating. And so I think that the Iranians, if the war expands, it will easily be able to destroy very key and sensitive installations and assets of the Israeli regime, whether inside the 1967 borders or beyond, or whether in Lebanon or Syria. The pain that Iran can inflict on the Israeli regime now is far greater because of the precision of the missiles and because of their ability to use evasive measures, and also because of the shortages that the United States and the Israeli regime now have when it comes to air defenses. And Iran is producing new missiles and drones far faster than the Americans have the ability to build new air defense missiles.